that Moshe Rabbeinu was the equivalent of the whole Sanhedrin. Although you need 70 dayonim, and that's a crucial number. You have to have 70 judges who are ordained by Moshe to be able to adjudicate certain laws. Otherwise you can't. But Moshe Rabbeinu in his own right was the equivalent of 70. What does that mean? But he's not 70. The answer is 70. You know, we spoke about the position of the Taz. The Taz says that you can use a shot glass of whiskey for Kiddush, although you need a revius. If you use wine, you have to have 2.9 ounces of revius. But if you use a shot glass, the shot glass, because of the intensity, concentration of alcohol, it's the equivalent. So the innate quality of the beverage compensates for the volume. That's the Taz, and that's what they rely on in terms of using only an ounce rather than using 2.9 ounces or a little more than that for whiskey. So there, it's the innate value. Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama, lahavdil, was the equivalent of all Klal Yisrael. Or when it came in terms of adjudicating, he was the equivalent of 70 because he was qualified. But you need 70. He is the equivalent of 70. We find that after Yericho, it says 36 people were killed because somebody had taken from the spoils of Jericho. But it says when 36, there was a person who was killed, who was the Rosh Sanhedrin. He was the equivalent of 36 Jews, the most special Jews. Said 36 doesn't mean 36 Jews. It means a Jew who was the equivalent of 36 in the Battle of Ai. So I want to mention something here. We have that a Kohen, that before he's qualified to officiate, although he's wearing the vestments and he has the pedigree, but if he doesn't ritualize his hands and feet before he does the avodah, he's not qualified to do the avodah. The service he does in the Mishkan or Beis Hamikdash is not valid. It's not valid. So you'd say, Gzeres HaKosov. What about if you go to the Kosel for nets, you have that water fountain outside where people wash their hands. Instead, if the Kohen washes hands in that, his feet and hands in that circular, whatever it is, stone water location, it's not called ritualization. He could use the cup and he could use whatever it is. It has to be a klisharis, it has to be a ministering vessel, has to be in the Mishkan, and the water has to be the water in the Mishkan. Now, what is it all about? We find the Sota that the suspected adulteress, and she claims her innocence after she was forewarned, so the only way you could verify whether she committed adultery or not, the Torah gives a certain ritual. If you follow that ritual, that will determine, and she takes certain oaths, whether she committed adultery or not. So the Torah tells us you take the water from the kior, and you take some of the dust off the floor of the sanctuary, the Mishkan, or the Beis Hamikdash, and you obliterate the rid of the sota into that water. And if she's guilty, it will destroy her. Physically, she will be destroyed. Her body will actually, her arteries and everything will expand to a point where they will burst. And literally, physically, she falls apart, like dismembering her. And if not, everything, her health becomes even more invigorated, healthier, whatever. She was barren, she could have children. She had ugly children, she will have beautiful children. That is the other side of it, if she was innocent. Now, so over there's Norah Chaim HaKodesh. Says something phenomenal. He says, why the water from the kior, and we speak about the Kohanim have to ritualize the hands from the kior and their feet, and why the dust from the sanctuary. When you mix that together, it becomes violent. Like there's such a turbulence and violent reaction, it totally destroys her. Why? So he explains that at the time of creation, God separated between the upper waters and the lower waters. And the lower waters were called Mei Bochim, the crying waters. They came to Hashem and said, it's not fair. The upper waters, because they remain in a spiritual realm, they're within your proximity. We were on the terrestrial level, we're detached from you. So it's not fair. Therefore, it's called Mei Bochim, from crying. the waters that cry. So Hashem says to them, to the water, to the Malach that represents the water, you will be in the Mishkan or the Beis HaMikdash, because the original intent is my presence should be on the terrestrial level, and that water in the Mishkan will have greater value, holier than the water in the spiritual realm, because that is the intent where my presence should be, associated with the terrestrial, within the Mishkan. What is the Mishkan? As we said, the Mishkan, the status, the value of the Mishkan was pre-Adam, pre-sin of Adam. So now, why did the Shekhinah, why did God's divine presence ascend from existence? For two reasons. Because Chava ate of the Eitz Hadas, and it says, Bo Nochash al Chava v'hitu bo zuamo. He committed adultery with her. He forced himself upon her, and actually, he infused her with this spiritual impurity. That's called zuama. And all mankind was affected by it, and we, until Sinai, had the effect of that spiritual pollution. God's presence at Sinai vaporized that. So the Ra of the Eitz Hadas remained within us. And that's why a person has to die. But that spiritual pollution, which brings an overwhelming level of addiction, we were detoxed. That was vaporized. And that's why a Jew has a level of Bechira, which a non-Jew doesn't have. A non-Jew, his parameters of Bechira are Shem Mitzvahs Nei Noach. A Jew has 365 mitzvahs. 365 negative and 248 positive. Because our acuity, when it comes to being able to discern and take control, is at a different level than the non-Jew. Because that addiction, that impurity, which disrupted our clarity, was vaporized when we're exposed to the Shekhinah, God's presence at Sinai. So now, why did God ascend from the terrestrial? Because adultery was committed, equivalent of that. Now, we have Mei Bochim. We have the water, which is the water which God says, I am associated with that water. That water has greater value than the water in the spiritual realm. That's the water of the Beis HaMikdash, or the Mishkan. When you take that water and you obliterate the rid of the sota and take some of the dust off the floor of the sanctuary is the equivalent of Gan Eden before the sin. The water is the water which has greater value than the water in the spiritual realm, because God is associated with that water. What happens now if the woman did commit adultery? That water all of a sudden becomes violent, because now there's going to be a detachment of that Shekhinah you're bringing back post-sin. This is the equivalent of Gan Eden, the Mishkan, the Beis HaMikdash. Now, in fact, she committed adultery. What is she doing? She's recreating the scenario which caused God to detach himself from the water and from the terrestrial. Therefore, as a result of that, there's this violent reaction which causes her to die. That's the Orach Chaim HaKodesh. So I'm saying, so when the Kohen ritualizes his hands and feet from that kior, it's a ministering vessel in a location where God's presence is there. What is that ritualization? That water is a water. It's not just ordinary water. It's not just holy water. This water is the water which has greater value than the water it's beyond celestial, the spiritual realm. Therefore, if you want to officiate, which is having that relation with Hashem, you have to undergo that process of ritualization of the water, of the kior specifically, which has that innate value of the ultimate level of holiness because of God's association with that water. So I'm only citing there to appreciate why it's Rochzu, Yedeim, Ragleim, Lo Yamusu. But if you don't, who are you? You're just an ordinary physical human being. But you need more than that. You have to ascend. You have to rise from that level. You have to undergo this process of spiritualization, which that spiritualization is directly connected because God gave that its value because God's association with it.
Rabbi, couldn't we also say that on a much lesser level, or I don't know, but when we say a bracha and we eat an apple, couldn't you say that we're taking that physicality and making it spiritual and taking us to another level?
No question. 100%, no question. But The Chofetz Chaim says that if you take an animal, which is just a mass of flesh and bones, and you consecrate it, unintelligible creature you consecrate, it's the right species, or even not. Or you take an inanimate object, the table, you consecrate it. Once it's consecrated, you're not permitted to benefit from the table. If you benefit it, there's consequences and liability. So a human being, a Jew who has a neshama, and he goes and he spiritualizes himself through the mitzvah, through Torah. What is the value of that? If something which is inanimate or unintelligible, when you designate it and associate it with God, it becomes something holy. So a Jew who is holy innately, and you go and he engages in what he should be, what effect, what's the consequence of that? It's beyond.